The late afternoon sun bathed the streets in golden light as people bustled about their business, unaware that something super was about to happen in that quiet corner of the neighborhood. By the entrance of a small cafe sat Marcus, a man in a wheelchair, very calm and composed, his eyes hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. Marcus looked like any other man enjoying his coffee, but the people who knew him well would tell you Marcus wasn't just anybody. He was a professional, not in a business sense but something entirely different, a killer. A group of young men came down the street, loud and brash, full of this misplaced confidence. The kind of guys who seemed to need to prove themselves in public, today feeling rather bold. The apparent leader of the group was Kyle, a tall guy who decided Marcus had been sitting there, sipping his quiet coffee for too long. He nudged his friends with an obvious smirk on his face. "Hey, check it out, boys," Kyle said, pointing at Marcus. "Let's see how tough this guy is." His friends snickered, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They formed a circle around Marcus, casting shadows over him, their laughter bouncing off the buildings. "Hey, old man," Kyle sneered, bending down so he was face to face with Marcus. "You enjoying your day out?" Slowly, Marcus made his way into his coffee and took a sip without changing his poise. Neither did he glance towards him. "I was, till you showed up." The calm voice carried no hint of fear or concern whatsoever. Kyle's face twitched, a flash of irritation crossing his features. He wasn't used to people talking back to him, especially not some guy in a wheelchair. "Oh, we got a funny guy here," he said, turning to his friends, who laughed in agreement. Kyle pushed Marcus' coffee cup off the table, the porcelain shattering on the pavement. Marcus let out a small sigh, adjusting his sunglasses. "That was unnecessary," he said, still calm. Kyle straightened, puffing out his chest. "What are you gonna do about it, huh?" he taunted. "You gonna roll after me?" His friends exploded into laughs as one of them playfully spun Marcus' wheelchair a little. The laughter ceased abruptly when Marcus reached down, his hands grasping the armrests of his wheelchair. Smooth, deliberate movements, he lifted himself slightly, repositioning his chair with ease that belied his condition. His eyes, hidden behind the sunglasses, were focused on Kyle, a cold, calculated focus that the young bully couldn't see but began to feel. "You boys should leave," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of finality that cut through their laughter. "Before you regret it." Kyle laughed again, though it was a bit forced this time. "Regret it? From you? That's a good one." He reached out to shove Marcus' shoulder, but before his hand could connect, Marcus moved. His arm shot out, his grip closing around Kyle's wrist with a strength that made Kyle yelp in surprise. "What the?" Kyle tried to pull back, but Marcus held firm, twisting Kyle's arm until the young man was forced to bend down, his face inches from Marcus. "You should learn some manners," Marcus said quietly, his voice calm, almost conversational. He let go of Kyle's arm, sending him stumbling backward into his friends. One of the other boys, a stout fellow named Joey, stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You think you're tough, old man?" he snarled, reaching for Marcus. But Marcus was faster. His hand darted out, striking Joey's leg just below the knee. Joey let out a yelp as his leg buckled, sending him sprawling to the ground in an undignified heap. With the sunglasses adjusted, Marcus hurried him back to Kyle, who stared him dead in the eyes, all traces of the half-smirk gone from his face. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said calmly. "But if you insist on making it, I'm more than capable of handling it." Kyle swallowed hard as his bravado crumbled. He looked to his friends, who weren't laughing anymore. Joey was still down on the ground, groaning while trying to get himself up. The rest stared up at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. Kyle stepped backward, hands up. All right, he said, his voice shaky. "We were just messing around, okay? No need to get all serious." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "Messing around can get you into trouble," he said. "Remember that." Kyle nodded quickly, gesturing for his friends to follow, and they hastily retreated, their arrogance deflated. For a moment, Marcus was left alone again. He watched them go, tugging a small smile onto the corner of his lips. He bent down, picking up the broken pieces of his coffee cup and setting them neatly on the table. The barista, a young woman who had watched the entire scene from behind the counter, stepped out, her eyes wide. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of concern and awe. Marcus nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine. Just a bit of a mess here," he said, gesturing to the broken cup. The barista glanced in the direction the bullies had fled, then back at Marcus. "That was incredible. I don't think they'll be bothering anyone again anytime soon." Marcus chuckled quietly. "Hope not. They just need to learn that there's always someone tougher out there." The barista smiled, bent down to help him pick up the pieces. "Let me get you another coffee on the house." Marcus nodded his head in appreciation. "Thank you. I could use another one." As the barista went back inside to make his coffee, Marcus settled back into his chair, his expression once again calm and relaxed. The sun was still shining, the streets still bustling, and to anyone passing by, he looked like just another man enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Yet beneath that calm exterior lay a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer, a man who knew how to handle himself even in a wheelchair. Marcus was used to people underestimating him because of his disability, something he was almost used to, something he used to his advantage. But today was different. Today, he had not only protected himself, he had also taught those young men a lesson they would not soon forget. And as he took a deep breath, savoring the warm breeze and the promise of a fresh cup of coffee, Marcus couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the best way to deal with any trouble lay in reminding the world that appearances could be highly deceiving, and underestimating the quiet ones could be a perilous mistake. The next week brought Marcus back to this small cafe, feeling the warm sun on his skin and a freshly brewed cup of coffee. He was a routine animal, and the baristas quickly learned to expect him at this spot by the door every morning. He liked the predictability of all this, the plainness after the experiences he had in life. But today, the peaceful routine was going to take an interesting turn. As Marcus sipped his coffee, he saw a ruckus going on across the street. The group of young men he knew all too well had congregated in front of a convenience store. Their loud voices, disturbingly familiar, belonged to Kyle and Joey, among others. The whole gang was making a scene, yelling at the store owner, who seemed intimidated and helpless by the gang of rough-necked bullies. Marcus watched for a moment, his face expressionless, as the shopkeeper tried to get the young men to leave in vain. Kyle, feeling braver now that his friends were there, pushed the shopkeeper, who stumbled backward. "Just give us the cash, old man," Kyle sneered, his voice filled with arrogance. "We don't want to hurt you, but we will if we have to." With a resigned sigh, Marcus set his coffee cup down. He had hoped his little encounter with Kyle and his friends out in the park the week before would have taught them some humility. It looked like that hadn't happened. He readjusted his sunglasses, narrowing his eyes behind the reflective lenses as he watched the scene before him. Looked like it was time for another reminder. Marcus quietly wheeled himself away from the cafe and across the street with practiced ease. He moved with purpose, his demeanor calm but focused. As he approached the convenience store, he could hear the fear in the shopkeeper's voice as he pleaded with the young men. "Please, just leave. I don't want any trouble," the shopkeeper said, his hands raised defensively. Kyle stepped closer, laughing. "Too late for that, old man. We want the money." Marcus cleared his throat, his voice cut through the noise like a knife. "I thought I told you boys to be careful about messing around." The group of young men turned, eyes widening as they saw Marcus wheeling towards them. Kyle's face paled a little, the cocky grin faltering for just a moment before he forced it back. "Oh, look who it is," he said, going for nonchalant. "The old guy in the wheelchair. You here to lecture us again, Grandpa?" Still bruising from their last confrontation, Joey stepped back, his eyes moving warily from Marcus to Kyle. "Maybe we should just go, Kyle," he muttered low under his breath. Kyle shot a glare at Joey. Pride got the better of him. "No, we are not running away from this guy. He is just one old man." He turned back to Marcus, his smirk returning. "What are you gonna do, huh?" Marcus stopped a few feet away from the group, his expression calm. almost bored. He cocked his head slightly, as if considering Kyle's question. "What am I going to do?" he repeated, his voice steady. "Well, that depends on you, Kyle. You can walk away now, and we'll call it even. Or..." Kyle scoffed, cutting Marcus off. "Or what? You gonna run us over with your wheelchair?" His friends laughed, though this time it was less confident, a nervous edge to their laughter. Marcus smiled, a cold, knowing smile. Something like that. Without warning, Marcus' hand shot out, grabbing a display rack full of bags of chips and pulling it down. The metal rack hit the floor with a resounding clang, the flying bags sending the young men jumping backward in surprise. Within the same movement, Marcus spun his wheelchair, his foot catching Joey in the shin, sending him falling backward with a yelp. Kyle's eyes widened as his bravado fled before the sight of Marcus moving with a speed and precision that belied his condition. Marcus wheeled forward, snatching Kyle by the front of his shirt, hauling him down until their faces were inches apart. "You think you're tough, Kyle?" Marcus said in a voice low, almost a whisper. "You think picking on shopkeepers and old men makes you a big man?" Kyle's eyes darted around, panic setting in. His friends had backed away, none daring to intervene. Let go of me," Kyle stammered. Marcus squeezed tighter, his eyes indistinguishable behind the darkened glasses. "I gave you a chance to walk away. But you didn't take it. Now you're going to listen to me." He paused, his voice even but with an unmistakable weight to it. "If I ever see you or your friends bothering anyone again, I won't be so easy on you. Do you understand me?" Kyle nodded wildly, his face red from fear and humiliation. Yeah, I understand it. Just let me go now." Marcus continued to hold on to Kyle for another second before letting go, pushing him back with a jerk that made Kyle stumble. Kyle struggled to his feet quickly, his hands shaking as he began to back away. "Come on, guys," he stuttered. "Let's get out of here." The group of young men hurried away, their arrogance shattered, leaving Marcus alone with the shopkeeper. The older man, who had been watching the scene with a mix of fear and awe, stepped forward, his hands still trembling slightly. Thank you," he stammered, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in." Marcus nodded and gave him a reassuring smile. "Just glad I could help," he said softly. "You shouldn't have to deal with punks like that." The shopkeeper took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as the tension ebbed slowly away. Can I offer you something? A drink, maybe? It's the least I can do." Marcus shook his head, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "No need, just stay safe, alright? If they come back, then don't hesitate calling the police." The shopkeeper nodded, his eyes with gratitude. "Will do, thank you again." Marcus gave a small nod, then turned, wheeling himself back across the street towards the cafe. The barista, who had watched the entire confrontation from the window, stepped out as Marcus approached, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and admiration. "You really don't know how to stay out of trouble, do you?" she said, a smile tugging at her lips. Marcus chuckled low in his throat and shrugged. "Trouble finds me, even when I don't go looking for it." He paused and looked in the direction Kyle and his friends had fled. But sometimes, trouble needs reminding that it is not as tough as it thinks it is. The girl behind the counter just shook her head. Her smile broadened. "Well, I think you've made quite an impression. I really don't think those guys will be coming back here anytime soon." He took a deep breath, nodded, and settled back into his usual spot. "Let's hope not. I like my coffee without the added excitement." He adjusted his sunglasses as the calm demeanor returned and he relaxed into the chair. The barista laughed, heading back inside to make him another cup of coffee on the house again. Marcus watched her go, a small smile on his face. He knew what he had done today would likely send ripples through the neighborhood. People would talk, and word would spread. And maybe, just maybe, it would make others think twice before causing trouble. As the sun was starting to set, giving off that sweet orange glow on the street, Marcus leaned back and enjoyed the serenity of such a moment. He knew the world was full of Kyle's people who, when they saw weakness, thought they could push people around. But Marcus had spent his entire life proving to the world that true strength didn't consist of physical power or intimidation. It was about staying calm in the face of chaos, about knowing when to act and when to hold back. And as he took a sip of his freshly brewed coffee, Marcus couldn't help but smile. Because today, once again, he had reminded the world that appearances could be deceiving, and underestimating him was always a mistake. The next day, Marcus sat in the cafe, sipping his usual coffee, finding comfort in the routine. He liked the quiet, the sense of familiarity that came with sitting in his usual spot and watching the world go by. As much as he enjoyed the peace, though, Marcus knew the calm never lasted. Life had a way of throwing curveballs just when you thought everything was settling down. It wasn't long before he noticed a couple of unfamiliar faces lingering around the cafe. They weren't part of Kyle's group, but Marcus knew that many of them were looking for someone, and they weren't here for the coffee. He watched them from behind his sunglasses, noticing their movements, and the way they spoke into their phones, their eyes scanning the street. One of them, a burly figure with a scar running down his cheek, finally spotted Marcus. He nudged his partner, a tall wiry man with a sharp gaze, and pointed in Marcus' direction. They started to make their way towards him, sternness etched upon their faces, each step with a mission. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, setting the cup down calmly. He had dealt with men like these before. They were muscle, hired hands sent to do someone else's dirty work. And judging by their demeanor, Marcus could tell they were serious. But serious didn't mean competent, and Marcus had encountered far worse in his time. The two men halted before Marcus' table, their silhouettes falling over him. The burly one spoke first, his voice low and gruff. "You Marcus?" Marcus cocked his head slightly, a small smile playing at his lips. "Depends who's asking." The wiry man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We're not here to play games, old man. You had a run-in with some friends of ours yesterday. Kyle and his crew." Marcus raised an eyebrow behind his sunglasses. "Ah, so you're here on behalf of the boys who thought it'd be a bright idea to bully a shopkeeper." He shook his head, letting out a small sigh. "I thought they would have learned their lesson by now." The big man reached in, his face inches from Marcus. "They did. But the boss didn't particularly like what he heard. He sent us to make sure you understand you don't mess with his people." Marcus didn't move. His face was unreadable as he could feel the tension from the two men. Their attempts at intimidating him were almost funny. Slightly leaning back, he folded his hands in his lap. "And who, precisely, is your boss?" The wiry man grinned. "You don't need to know his name. You should know he isn't someone you want to mess with. He told us to give you a message, and we're here to deliver it." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering their words. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed the edge of the table and flipped it upwards, catching both men off guard by the sudden movement. The table crashed into the burly man's chest, sending him stumbling backward. Before the wiry man could react, Marcus spun his wheelchair, his hand darting out to grab the man's wrist and twisting it sharply, pulling him down to his level. "You boys really need to work on your delivery," Marcus said calmly, almost amused. He twisted the wiry man's arm further, making him wince in pain. "You come here making threats, thinking you can intimidate me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." The wiry man gritted his teeth, his face contorted in pain. Let go of me," he hissed, his voice strained. Marcus' grip tightened, his face went cold. "I want you to go back to your boss. Tell him I don't appreciate his message. And if he has a problem with me, he can come talk to me himself." He paused, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But if he sends more of you after me, I promise you, they won't be walking away." With that, Marcus let the man's wrist go, shoving him backward. The wiry man tumbled, almost falling to the ground but catching himself in time. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes wide with both fear and disbelief. The burly man, still reeling from the impact of the table, grasped at his partner's arm, pulling him away. "Come on," the burly man muttered, his voice trembling. "Let's get out of here." The two men hastened away, their arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of fear. Marcus watched them go, his expression once more calm as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He readjusted his sunglasses, leaned back in his wheelchair, and let out a slow breath. The barista, who had been watching the entire scene from inside the cafe, stepped out cautiously, her eyes wide. Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine. Just a couple of guys who needed a reminder to mind their own business." The barista shook her head, her expression one of half incredulous, half admiring. "You keep this up, and we're going to have to start calling you the guardian of the neighborhood." Marcus chuckled softly. "I just don't like bullies. That's all." He glanced down at the overturned table, the broken cup lying on the ground. "Sorry about the mess." The barista waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it. They'll get it cleaned up. And your next coffee is on the house, again." Marcus smiled, nodding in appreciation. "Thank you. I could use another one." As the barista went inside to make his coffee, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through what had just happened. It was obvious that Kyle and his friends hadn't acted alone. They had someone behind them, someone who thought they could send a message by sending a couple of thugs to intimidate him. Marcus had dealt with people like this before. He knew the type. Those who thrived on fear and intimidation, who believed they could control others through brute force. But Marcus had spent his life facing down threats far greater than this, and he wasn't about to be scared off by a couple of hired hands. He took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to the street where the two men had disappeared. If their boss wanted a fight, Marcus would be ready. But he hoped it wouldn't have to come to that. He had left that life behind, at least he had tried to. All he wanted now was peace, a quiet life where he could enjoy his coffee and watch the world go by without having to look over his shoulder. But if forced to, Marcus knew he would not back away. He had fought too hard, survived too much to let anyone take his earned peace away. And if they thought his wheelchair made him weak, they were sorely mistaken. The barista returned, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. She set it down on the table beside Marcus and gave him a warm smile. "Here you go. Hopefully, you can enjoy this one without any more interruptions." Marcus nodded, one side of his lips curling upwards in a hint of a smile. "Thanks. It should be relatively quiet for some time." He drank, enjoying the rich, warm flavor. The sun remained high, the day remained beautiful, and Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace. But in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't over. Whoever was behind Kyle and his friends would likely come looking for him again. And when they did, Marcus would be ready. Had faced worse than this, much worse, and had come out the other side. He wasn't afraid of what was to come. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus watched the people passing by, the soft hum of the city around him. He knew that life was unpredictable, that peace was often fleeting. But for now, he had his coffee, his spot in the sun, and the knowledge that he was still capable of handling whatever challenges came his way. And as he had taken another sip, a smile tipped Marcus' lips. For whatever was to befall, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't that kind of man to underestimate. The sun was barely up the next morning, but Marcus' instincts told him something was wrong, an instinct that always kicked in whenever a situation called for trusting his gut, which is what kept him alive all those years as a professional. He wheeled himself to the window of his small apartment and peered through the blinds. A dark sedan was parked across the street, and a man sat in the driver's seat, his eyes fixed on Marcus' building. It looked as though things were going to escalate faster than he had hoped. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had hoped that the message he sent yesterday would have been enough to dissuade whoever was behind this, but clearly, they were more persistent than he had anticipated. It was time to take matters into his own hands, and this time, he wouldn't wait for them to come to him. He moved with quick efficiency, fetching a few items from a locked cabinet, a small earpiece, a set of gloves, and a simple yet effective tool kit. He wasn't planning on an all-out confrontation, at least not yet. No, Marcus was going to gather information first. He needed to know who he was dealing with, and why they had targeted him. By late morning, Marcus had made his way to the alley behind the building. The dark sedan was still there, the driver oblivious to Marcus' movements. Keeping to the shadows, Marcus approached from behind, his wheelchair gliding silently over the pavement. He took his time, watching the driver from a distance, noting his behavior, how he was constantly on his phone, glancing at the building, his impatience evident. Marcus rolled closer, finally coming up behind the car, staying out of sight. He reached into his toolkit, pulling out a small mirror attached to a telescopic rod, angling it to get a better look at the driver. The man was muscular, clean-cut, and had an earpiece in his ear, standard fare for hired muscle. Marcus noted the small insignia on the man's jacket, a logo he recognized from his past. It came to him now like a cold wave. They were Varnon Syndicate, an organization Marcus had crossed many years ago. It made sense now. The syndicate didn't like loose ends, and Marcus was about as loose an end as it got. Marcus knew he had to move, and fast. He wheeled back into the shadows, weighing his options. It was obvious that whoever was in charge here wasn't going to let this slide. He could sit and wait for them to come for him, or he could take the fight to them, ending this once and for all. And Marcus was never one to sit and wait. That night, Marcus made his move. The address had managed to glean from the driver's phone led him to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a typical choice for people who didn't want their activities scrutinized. The place was dimly lit, with a couple of guards posted at the entrance. Marcus stayed in the shadows, observing their patterns, the way they moved. They were lax, not expecting any trouble. Perfect. Marcus moved silently, slipping around the side of the building. He found a service entrance, the door locked but not alarmed. He pulled out his toolkit, deftly picking the lock. The door clicked open with ease. He wheeled himself inside, pausing to let his eyes adjust to the darkness. He could hear voices, two men talking, their conversation casual, oblivious to the danger that had just entered their domain. He followed the voices, treading silently down the darkened corridors until he came to a large open area, the center of the warehouse. There, sitting at a makeshift desk, was a man Marcus recognized immediately, Victor Varnon, one of the syndicate's top lieutenants. He was surrounded by a few of his men, their laughter echoing through the empty space as they shared stories and drinks. Marcus wheeled himself closer, keeping to the shadows until he was just a few feet away from the group. He cleared his throat, and his voice cut through their laughter like a knife. "I hear you've been looking for me." The reaction was instantaneous. The men leaped to their feet, their hands going to their sidearms, their eyes wide with incredulity. Victor's gaze cut to Marcus, his face transitioning from surprise to something darker, a mixture of anger and incredulity. "You," Victor said, his voice low with disdain. "I should have known you'd come here. You never did know when to quit." Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I could say the same about you, Victor. Sending your boys to intimidate me? That was a mistake." Victor sneered, gesturing to his men. "Kill him." The men moved, but Marcus was faster. He pulled a smoke grenade from his side pouch and yanked out the pin. He hurled it into the middle of the room. The flare and the grenade exploded into a thick smoke that filled the room. As the men coughed their lungs out, their vision obscured. Marcus made his move, wheeling himself with precision and purpose, using the moment of confusion. He was suddenly everywhere in the room, his senses tuned, his training kicking in. He could hear the men fumbling, their footsteps heavy as they stumbled through the smoke. Marcus struck with precision, a jab to the back of the knee here, a swift hit to the gut there, taking them down one by one, leaving them gasping on the ground. Victor stumbled through the smoke, his eyes wide with panic, like any other disoriented person. It was too thick, and he could barely see. Everything around him was indistinct and vague. He heard the sound of Marcus' wheelchair, the faint whir of wheels cutting through the chaos, and turned, his gun raised, his finger trembling on the trigger. But Marcus was there. He grabbed Victor's wrist, twisting it sharply, forcing the gun from his hand. Victor cried out in pain, dropping to his knees as Marcus loomed over him, his expression cold, unyielding. "You should have left well enough alone, Victor," Marcus said, his voice low, deadly. "I was done with all of this. But you had to pull me back in." Victor's eyes, wide with terror, looked up at him. "Please," he gasped. "It wasn't personal. It was just business." Marcus shook his head. His hand tightened on Victor's wrist. "That's the problem with people like you. You think you can do whatever you want, hurt whomever you want, and call it business." The air condensed as he stepped in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But some things are personal. And this is one of them." With that said, Marcus released Victor, who fell back as he pushed him backward. Victor fell to the ground, scrambling away, his eyes wide with terror. Marcus watched him for a moment, then wheeled himself in the direction of the exit. The smoke was beginning to dissipate, and groans came from the men on the ground, trying to recover. Marcus moved with purpose, his expression calm, his mission complete. At the door, Marcus turned back to Victor, who was still on the floor, white as a ghost, his hands shaking. "Tell your boss," Marcus called out across the room, "that if he wants me, he'll have to come himself. And if he does, he should be prepared for what he'll find." With that, Marcus finally pushed open the door, disappeared into the night, cool air filling his lungs as he made his way back to his car. He had sent his message, and he knew it would be heard. The syndicate would think twice before coming after him again, and if not, well, Marcus was ready for whatever came next. He headed back into the city, its lights starting to grow into a skyline as he made his way closer. It brought a kind of calm, soothing feeling in him. Finally, it seemed like a part of the closure he was long due had arrived. Ghosts of the past had faced off, a reminder that he wasn't some insignificant figure to mess with. Now, finally, peace would occur. The next morning found Marcus back in the cafe, his spot near the entrance occupied, with a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. The barista smiled at him, her eyes all curiosity. "You seem more relaxed today," she said, light in tone. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, nodding. "I think things are finally settling down," he said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. The barista raised an eyebrow. "No more trouble?" Marcus chuckled low. "No more trouble. At least, not for now." She nodded, smiling back at him warmly before turning back inside. Marcus settled back in his chair, his face warming in the sun as the city came alive around him. He knew life was unpredictable, that peace would never be a guarantee. For now, he had his coffee, his spot in the sun, and the knowledge he had faced his past and come out on top. And as he sat there, watching the world go by, Marcus knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, he would be ready. For he wasn't just a man in a wheelchair, he was a survivor, a fighter, and no one would ever take that away from him.